Welcome to The Clue Cafe, where mysteries brew and every detail matters. I'm thrilled to have you here. Whether you're a lifelong detective fiction fan or just love a good puzzle, you've found the right place. Before we dive into today's mystery, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? I'd love to see how far our curious community reaches. Chapter 1. The Letter from Northumberland. It was on the third morning of October, grey-skied and stiff with a chill wind from the north, that a letter arrived at 221 B Baker Street, sealed with red wax and bearing a curious crest, a silver quill upon a field of black. I had just set down my teacup when Mrs. Hudson brought it in, her eyebrows lifted ever so slightly, as though the envelope carried an air of solemnity with it. "It's for Mr. Holmes," she said. "From a solicitor, I believe, Northumberland." Holmes, who had been lounging in his chair, violin in hand and chin to string but not yet playing, opened one eye and extended a long hand without rising. "Solicitors write only when a mystery outpaces their legal lexicons," he muttered, cracking the seal. "Let us see whether this is a matter of inheritance, fraud, or murder. Perhaps all three." His eyes scanned the contents quickly. I watched the subtle tightening at the corners of his mouth, the faint lift of an eyebrow. "Well?" I asked, unable to contain my curiosity. Holmes folded the letter and handed it to me. "Read it aloud, Watson." There is something delightfully Gothic about its composition. A dash of the macabre never fails to stir the brain into action. I took the letter and began. "Dear Mr. Holmes, I write to you on behalf of my client, Sir Cedric Draycott, Baronet of Draycott Hall, Northumberland. He is greatly troubled by a series of most unusual and, frankly, unnerving events that have recently plagued his household. 2 days ago, a footman named George Lyle collapsed without apparent cause after reading aloud a letter left anonymously upon his tray. He remains in a state of deep unconsciousness, and no physician thus far has offered explanation or cure. Whispers among the staff speak of a curse, more specifically, that the letter was written using a quill said to have belonged to Sir Cedric's ancestor, the exiled poet Roderick Draycott, whose tragic death has long given rise to superstitions surrounding his possessions. Sir Cedric, being a man of rational mind but desperate concern, has instructed me to seek your assistance. Should you accept, arrangements for your travel and accommodation will be made immediately. With highest regard, Hiram P. Wexley, Solicitor, to the Draycott Estate. I set the letter down. Holmes had risen and was already pacing in that slow, deliberate rhythm which meant he was turning over ideas like stones in a garden. "You look intrigued," I remarked. Holmes stopped beside the window and clasped his hands behind his back. "Watson, what do you make of a man falling unconscious after reading a letter, and the household attributing it to a cursed quill?" "I'd say nonsense, of course. Some rare illness, perhaps, but the mention of a cursed quill, that's mere superstition." "Precisely," Holmes said, and turned with a gleam in his eye. "And yet superstitions have always fascinated me. They provide cover for crimes. They are shadows where truth hides. The rational mind must not dismiss them outright, but rather examine what they obscure." He crossed the room in 2 long strides and pulled out a railway timetable. "Draycott Hall," he murmured, tracing the lines. "Alnwick. It will take the better part of the day. I hope you've no pressing appointments?" "None I can't postpone," I said at once. "Do you truly suspect foul play?" "Watson, any case involving anonymous letters, superstitions, and the sudden collapse of a healthy man begs further inquiry. If this is merely hysteria, very well. But if it is something more, then Draycott Hall may be host to more than just ghosts of poetry." We departed that afternoon under a bruised sky, the air heavy with rain that finally broke somewhere past York. Holmes, bundled in his travelling cloak, spoke little during the journey, though I noticed his eyes never left the letter or its seal. He examined the wax under a glass, made idle notes in his pocketbook, and once muttered something about ash content in paper stock. As we approached the north, the scenery grew wilder. Rolling moors, black pine forests, and stretches of barren heathland, interrupted only by the occasional crumbling farmhouse. It was late evening when we arrived at the station near Alnwick, where a closed carriage bearing the Draycott livery awaited us. The drive to the hall was a quiet one, save for the wind whispering through the hedgerows and the occasional bark of a distant dog. Draycott Hall, when it emerged from behind the pines, was exactly as one might picture a house rumoured to be cursed. A long, low Georgian structure of dark stone set behind wrought iron gates, with ivy clawing at its western facade, and a single tower rising above the main building like a watching eye. We were received by the butler, a stiff, elderly man named Pell. He said little beyond, "Sir Cedric awaits you in the drawing-room," but I caught a tremor in his voice and the way his eyes flicked toward the upper landing as if watching for something unseen. Inside, the house was dimly lit and sparsely adorned. The drawing-room itself was warmed by a fire, and there stood Sir Cedric Draycott, a tall, narrow-shouldered man with iron-grey hair and the weary expression of one beset by something he could not explain. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I cannot tell you how grateful I am." Holmes inclined his head. "You have my attention, Sir Cedric. I understand you've a household afflicted by a quill." Sir Cedric gave a humourless chuckle. "So the servants say. It is, of course, complete drivel. But when one man lies in a stupor, and another refuses to enter the library for fear of hearing Latin whispers in the walls, a gentleman must concede that rationality has limits." "You believe the incident's connected?" "I don't know what to believe, but I do know that since the letter appeared there's been unrest. Old stories, you see. About my great-uncle Roderick Draycott. A poet. A madman, they said. He died in Naples, or so the records claim, and left behind strange writings. They say he wrote with a quill soaked in blood and ink, and that his verses drove men mad. Complete fabrication, of course. And yet, Holmes held up a finger. "The letter your footman read, do you still have it?" "I've kept it locked in my desk. No one has touched it since the incident." "Excellent," Holmes said. "We shall need to examine the letter, the tray on which it was found, and the room in which he collapsed. Dr. Watson will also want to see the patient, I'm sure." "Of course," Sir Cedric said. "But I must warn you, the house is on edge. Some of the staff have already left. Lady Draycott is fearful, though she masks it, and there have been other oddities." "Such as?" He hesitated. "The dogs refuse to go near the boathouse by the lake. Pell says he's seen a man in the woods who vanishes when approached. It may be nothing, but I've lived here my whole life, and something is wrong, Mr. Holmes. Something is not right." Holmes smiled thinly and rubbed his hands together. "Sir Cedric, I assure you, there is nothing in this world so cursed that it cannot be understood. We shall begin in the morning. Until then, I suggest we all sleep. Or pretend to." Chapter 2. The Man by the Lake. The next morning broke cold and colourless, with a thick fog clinging low over the grounds of Draycott Hall. From my bedroom window I saw the trees looming like silent sentinels, and the lake beyond them flat and grey, with only the faintest ripple betraying the presence of wind. It was a place of quiet menace, beautiful but brooding. After a light breakfast in the solemn dining room, Holmes requested a tour of the house and grounds. Sir Cedric obliged, leading us first to the scene of the initial incident. The footman's quarters on the second floor. George Lyle lay motionless in bed, his skin pale and clammy, his breathing shallow but steady. "I've had doctors in from Alnwick and even as far as Newcastle," Sir Cedric said. "They find no trauma, no sign of seizure." One said it was nervous exhaustion. Another suggested he had suffered an aesthetic shock, whatever that may mean. Holmes bent over the young man and examined his fingers, lifting one hand gently by the wrist. "See here, Watson," he said. "Faint staining under the nails, a yellowish tinge. Do you see it?" I leaned in. "Yes, but faint, not nicotine. Could it be from ink?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Indeed, ink laced with something rather unkind, I suspect." Sir Cedric drew back slightly. "You mean he was poisoned?" "Not in the usual sense," Holmes said. "There are agents that act transdermally, pseudo-absorbed through the skin, especially where it is sensitive. The fingertips, for example. Was he reading the letter with his bare hands?" "He was, yes. He picked it up off the tray and read it aloud to Lady Draycott at her request. A moment later, he trembled, turned grey, and collapsed." "Where is the letter now?" Holmes asked. "In my desk, locked." "We shall come to it in due course," Holmes said. "First, I'd like to see the lake." Sir Cedric looked surprised. "The lake?" "Where your dogs fear to tread," Holmes said with a faint smile. "Always trust the instincts of animals, Sir Cedric. They see what we do not. The lake lay a quarter-mile from the house, beyond a yew hedge, and past a collapsed garden folly. The fog clung thickest here, muting sound and shrinking the world to 20 paces in any direction. The water was low, its banks muddy and pocked with bird prints. Holmes moved like a bloodhound, his gaze downward, hands clasped behind his back. Occasionally, he knelt to inspect a scuff in the earth or a broken reed. I followed behind him, boots sinking slightly with every step. "Here," Holmes said abruptly, pointing to a patch near the boathouse, a weathered structure of damp timber and a sagging roof. I stepped closer. There were boot prints, clear in the mud, leading away from the boathouse and into the woods beyond. Not just one pair, but two. One deep and squared off, the other narrower and more hurried. "Recently made," Holmes said. "Within the last day. Note the sharpness of the impressions. The rain has not softened them yet. And here," he stooped and plucked something from the ground. A half-smoked cigar, its end crushed, but the outer paper still intact. Holmes held it up, rotating it slowly. "What do you make of this, Watson?" "Imported, good quality. Smoked recently. There's a faint embossing on the wrapper." "A crowned R," Holmes finished. "Not a manufacturer's mark, a monogram. Someone took the trouble to have their initials printed on their cigars. A man of vanity or precision. Do you think this man was here last night?" "I think," Holmes said, straightening, "that he came here to meet someone, possibly to leave something, possibly to retrieve it, and I think he left in a hurry." Holmes turned to the boathouse and with a cautious push opened the door. It was dark inside, the air thick with the smell of rot and fish oil. Old oars lay stacked against the wall, and a tattered tarpaulin covered what might have once been a canoe. Holmes moved to a shelf near the rear and brushed away dust. "Someone's been here recently. Look, the dust is disturbed. And this..." He pulled down a small box, black lacquer with a silver latch. Opening it revealed a set of blank parchment sheets and a compartment for writing instruments. All were gone save a narrow groove, stained dark at one end. Holmes held it under the light seeping through the door. "Quill was kept here," he said. "Possibly the infamous one." Sir Cedric, who had remained silent until now, gave a visible shudder. "Are you saying this man, the one who left the cigar, has the quill?" "I'm saying he may have handled it," Holmes replied. "But whether he owns it, planted it, or fears it, that remains to be seen." We returned to the house through the woods, Holmes stopping briefly to study a broken twig at shoulder height. A sign, he said, that someone had passed through in haste. As we neared the service door, a figure emerged from the shrubbery, startling both Sir Cedric and myself. It was a groundsman, tall, bearded, with a bandaged hand and mud on his trousers. His name, we later learned, was Harris. "Mr. Holmes?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes?" "I saw something last night, near the lake. A man in a grey coat, tall, stood just beyond the tree line, didn't move, just watched." "What time?" "After midnight. I was out looking for a lost hound. I called to him. He turned and walked off, fast." "Did you see his face?" "No, sir, but he walked with a limp." Holmes was suddenly alert. "A limp, left or right leg?" "Right." Holmes nodded. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Harris." As Harris left, Holmes turned to me with a rare expression of anticipation. "Watson, we have a limping man in a grey coat with expensive cigars creeping around the lake and vanishing at midnight. Tell me, does this not quicken the pulse?" "It does," I admitted. "But what of the letter and the so-called curse?" "That, my dear fellow, is the trap. A distraction. While our eyes fixate on poetry and ghosts, something far more deliberate is at work. Let us return to the house. I should very much like to examine that letter." Back in Sir Cedric's study, Holmes was given the letter, still in its original envelope, handled only with gloves since the incident. He studied the parchment, sniffed it, and then reached for his lens. "Look at the texture," he said. "See how the fibers rise here? Not standard paper, hand-pressed, Italian, possibly from Florence. And the ink, faded, yes, but inconsistently so. There are signs it has been tampered with, a second script layered atop the first, now chemically faded. Watson, do you recall our experience with palimpsests in the Baltic forgery case?" "Of course," I said. "Then you'll understand what I mean when I say this document was altered, quite recently, and by someone who knew their toxins." He placed the letter gently down. "We are not dealing with madness, Watson. We are dealing with method. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to create the illusion of a literary curse, and I intend to find out why." Chapter 3. The second stroke. The morning mist had scarcely lifted from the lawns of Draycott Hall when a new commotion broke the uneasy calm. Holmes and I were seated in the library, poring over ink analysis results he had mixed with meticulous care, on the writing desk, when a knock as frantic as it was loud shattered the quiet. Sir Cedric burst into the room, pale and shaken. "There's been another incident," he said. "In the drawing room, one of the maids, Annabel, she's dead." Without a word, Holmes rose and swept from the room with the purposeful stride of a man whose suspicions had just solidified into something more. We found Annabel sprawled on the floral carpet beside a settee, one hand resting on the drapery cord, the other clutching a cloth used for dusting. Her expression was frozen in an unnatural grimace, eyes wide, lips drawn taut as though terror had seized her in her final breath. Lady Draycott stood nearby, clutching a handkerchief to her mouth, while the other servants huddled in the corridor like children fearing thunder. Holmes knelt by the body and gestured for me to do the same. I checked for pulse, respiration, but there was no question. She had expired less than an hour before. "Cause of death?" he asked. "Undetermined," I said. "No bruising, no wounds. It's as though her heart simply gave out." Holmes examined her fingers, then moved to her mouth. He sniffed lightly, then rose. "There is a scent of almonds, very faint." I nodded grimly. "Cyanide, perhaps?" "Possibly. But if so, it was absorbed, not ingested. There are no cups nearby, no glasses. She didn't drink anything." "Then how?" Holmes raised a hand, already scanning the room. "Where precisely did she fall?" he asked the butler, Pell, who stood nearby, trembling. "Just there, sir, by the window. She was dusting the frames. I stepped out for a moment and returned to find her on the floor." Holmes crossed to the window, inspecting the sill and the frame. "Watson," he called, "bring the glass." I handed over his lens and he peered at the wooden edge, tilting his head this way and that. Then he pointed. "Observe, a smear, nearly invisible, clear but slightly glossy, and here, on the curtain cord, the same. Whatever it is, she touched it." He produced a scrap of litmus paper and dabbed it against the smear. It changed colour faintly, a sign of chemical presence. She may have wiped the residue and then, unwittingly, touched her face or rubbed her lip. Even minimal exposure, if the compound is potent enough, would suffice. Sir Cedric stood silently by the fireplace, watching Holmes with haunted eyes. "Who would do such a thing?" he asked. "Why kill a maid?" Holmes's response was curiously calm. "Because she saw something, or heard something." Lady Draycott looked up sharply. "She came to me yesterday," she said, her voice thin and trembling. "She said she'd heard a voice in the library the night before, a man speaking Latin. She thought it was a ghost." Holmes turned to her. "Was anyone else informed?" "I don't think so. She was frightened. I told her to get some rest and not to speak of it further." Holmes's expression remained unreadable. He turned back to me. "Watson, do you recall what Sir Cedric said about the letter being read aloud? And now this girl hears Latin in the night. It seems our mysterious playwright is not content with ink and paper. He wants an audience." Later that afternoon, Holmes and I returned to the library. The room was quiet, cloaked in that same cool stillness it had held the day before. Yet something felt subtly changed. "Notice anything?" Holmes asked. I looked around. "The fire was not lit yesterday, but it is now." "Precisely. And yet the weather is mild. Odd, don't you think?" He knelt before the hearth and poked the ashes with the tip of his cane. They parted easily, revealing unburned edges of paper at the bottom. He retrieved one and held it up to the light. "Printed verse," he murmured. "The same paper type as the letter. Someone burned additional pages, possibly more of the forged manuscript." "Why not destroy it completely?" I asked. "Perhaps they were interrupted, or perhaps," Holmes said, "they wanted us to know it once existed." As he turned to replace the scrap, his gaze fell on the back of the library chair, a high-backed armchair of velvet and mahogany. "Watson, bring the lantern." I held it aloft as he crouched behind the chair. On the upper slat of the frame, barely visible, was a small, charred mark. "Cigarette ash," Holmes said. "Not from cigars. Lady Draycott smokes slender Turkish cigarettes. I saw them in her dressing table, but she claims she does not enter the library. You think she's lying?" "I think she was here, recently, and not alone." Holmes stood, brushing dust from his knees. "We are looking for someone who understands Latin, possesses rare poisons, has access to Roderick Draycott's personal items, and prefers theatrical flourishes, someone intelligent, precise, and confident enough to stage death like a performance." He looked to the far shelves where dusty volumes lined the walls. Then he walked straight to a narrow cabinet, unlatched it, and pulled out an old ledger. "Roderick's journals," he said. "These were catalogued decades ago after his death. But there's a gap. Volume 5 is missing. Could it have been lost?" "Possibly," Holmes said. "Or it is being used." The remainder of the day passed in quiet examination. Holmes spent hours in the study, reviewing Sir Cedric's family records and questioning the servants, with that soft-spoken intensity that always got more out of them than expected. That evening, as we sat by the fire in our guest quarters, Holmes seemed unusually quiet. His violin rested in the corner, untouched. "Do you think Richard Draycott is involved?" I asked. "The man seen near the lake? The one with the crowned R on the cigar?" Holmes gave a thoughtful hum. "He is not uninvolved, but whether he's the puppet or the puppeteer, that remains to be seen." "You believe the killer is part of the household?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that every death has a motive, and if we find who benefits from these deaths, we shall find our killer." He rose and crossed to the window, gazing out over the darkened garden. "Two victims," he said, "one silenced after reading, the other after hearing. The method is exotic, but the intent is clear. This is a performance. Someone is staging fear like a playwright stages a tragedy, and I very much doubt the curtain has yet fallen." Chapter 4. The Forgotten Manuscript. It was nearly dawn when Holmes rapped sharply on my door, waking me from a fitful sleep. The hallway outside was lit only by a single oil lamp, casting long shadows that flickered against the wainscoting. Holmes, fully dressed and with a lantern in hand, motioned for me to follow without a word. "Where are we going at this hour?" I asked groggily as I hurried into my boots. "To the cellars," he replied crisply. "Sir Cedric has granted access to Roderick Draycott's effects. I intend to see them before the day brings more death." We made our way down a back staircase that smelled of damp stone and disuse. Pell, the butler, met us at the foot of the stairwell with a rusted key and a look of unmistakable unease. "You'll find them in the vault room," he muttered. "Far end of the wine corridor, been locked up since Sir Cedric's father passed." "And no one else has entered since?" Holmes asked. "Not unless they went through stone and iron, sir." The key turned with a protesting groan, and the vault door opened into darkness that swallowed the meagre light of our lantern. The air inside was cold and dry, with the peculiar stillness of long-forgotten rooms. The walls were lined with shelves, many of them empty or covered in mouldering cloth. At the far end stood a chest, an old, sea-worn trunk, banded in tarnished brass. Holmes approached it slowly, like a man approaching an altar. He opened it without hesitation. Inside lay several items: a bundle of yellowed manuscripts tied with black ribbon, a broken inkwell, a framed miniature of a young man with striking eyes and unruly hair, and, resting delicately atop a velvet-lined box, a peacock feather quill. Even in the low light, the quill shimmered green and gold, its tip browned with ancient ink. Holmes stared at it in silence for a moment. "Beautiful," he murmured, "and dangerous." He lifted the box carefully and opened it. The interior was fitted with slots for parchment, a small compartment that once held ink, and a hidden recess beneath the velvet lining, now empty. "No penknife," Holmes noted. "No ink now either, but this is the source, the item around which our phantom drama has been written." He held up one of the manuscripts and flipped through the pages. "Latin and Greek," he said, "snippets of poetry, references to death, transformation, madness. But look here, this one is different." He separated a single sheet from the bundle. "It's a draft," he said, "an unfinished composition, but written in two hands, the lower portion. See the difference in ink density, the form of the letters?" Someone attempted to mimic Roderick's style. I leaned in and saw it clearly. The upper lines were tight, erratic, as if the writer struggled to contain emotion. The lower lines, though similar in form, were more deliberate, calculated. "A forgery?" I asked. "Indeed," Holmes said, "and very recently done." He slid the parchment into his pocket and turned to the trunk again. He checked beneath the lining, between the boards, and under the framing. At last, in the base of the lid, he found what he was searching for, a compartment sealed with a faded Draycott crest. He pried it open. Inside was a tightly rolled document, brittle and sealed with a cracked wax imprint. "This," he said, "is volume 5 of the journals, the one missing from the library." Holmes unrolled a portion, carefully avoiding the flaking edges. "The handwriting matches the original," he said. "And here, entries about a visit to Florence, references to ink making with medicinal plants. A recipe? No, a formula." He read aloud. "To silence truth with ink alone, apply the draught by hand, not mouth, for skin carries secrets deeper than tongue." I felt a chill as he spoke the words. "This is our killer's manual," Holmes said. "Whoever read this realized they could turn poetry into poison, but they needed the quill and the legend around it to cloak their actions." "But who, Holmes?" I asked. "Who here knows Latin, knew about the cellar, and would have access to this box?" "Someone who benefits from chaos," Holmes replied. "Someone who understands theatre, who wants to create fear before they strike." He stood, brushing dust from his sleeves. "We must return before the house stirs. The manuscript must remain secret for now. I do not want our phantom tipped off." Later that morning, over a breakfast that was largely untouched, Holmes requested to speak with Lady Draycott. She met us in the morning room, impeccably dressed as always, though her complexion was paler than usual. "Lady Draycott," Holmes began with his customary courtesy, "did your husband ever speak to you about the cellar vaults?" She gave a faint, uncomfortable smile. "Only that they were sealed. His father kept them locked. Old relics," he said, "nothing of value. And yet Roderick's personal writings were kept there." She tilted her head. "So I am told, but I never saw them." "You read Latin, do you not?" Her lips thinned. "A little. I studied in Italy before my marriage." "And poetry?" Holmes asked. "I enjoyed it as a girl. Less so now." Holmes nodded as if satisfied. "One final question. Did you ever meet Richard Draycott?" At this, a flicker crossed her expression. "Once, briefly, before he left for Africa. He was charming, arrogant." "And did he ever return?" "No," she said softly. "Not to my knowledge." Holmes gave a polite bow and turned away. We left the room in silence. Once we were out of earshot, I asked, "Do you believe her?" "She's hiding something," Holmes said. "But not what I suspected. She's frightened. I'd wager she's received a letter, perhaps a threat." That afternoon, a storm rolled in from the sea, drenching the moorland in sudden sheets of rain. Holmes disappeared for several hours into the woods, returning with a soaked coat and a triumphant expression. In his hand, he held a telegram, crumpled and dirt-streaked, but intact. "It was buried," he said. "Near the east hedge, someone tried to destroy it, but the weather preserved it." The message read, "To Richard Draycott, return immediately. Ink formula verified. Do not delay. Roderick's manuscript must be secured." Our Holmes tapped the signature. "Not Richard. The sender is using his initial to throw suspicion." "Then who is R?" "That Watson," he said, "is the final mask to be lifted." That evening Holmes made an announcement to the household. "I have requested that everyone assemble in the library tomorrow at noon. The curse shall be lifted, or fulfilled." There were murmurs, uneasy glances. Afterwards, Holmes stood with me in the corridor and said, "We now have our motive, our method, and soon our culprit. But it must be revealed dramatically, Watson, as they intended it. The killer made this a performance. I intend to end it on their stage." Chapter 5. The Visitor in the Fog. The storm raged well into the evening, as if nature itself were playing accomplice, to the strange events unfolding at Draycott Hall. Trees groaned under the wind, and shutters clattered like bones knocking in a crypt. By nightfall, the house was a cocoon of flickering candlelight and tense silence. Holmes, though wearied from the day's excursions, showed no signs of rest. After a light supper, he retired not to his room, but to the east wing, where he could watch the gardens and the wooded path leading to the lake. I joined him, nursing a cup of strong tea, while he remained still as a statue near the frost-blurred window. "I expect our visitor will come tonight," Holmes said quietly, without turning. "The man in the grey coat?" I asked. "Yes, whoever he is, he cannot stay hidden much longer. The noose is tightening. Fear and opportunity have drawn him into motion. We must be ready." We waited in silence. Hours passed. Midnight crept in. The fire burned low. Then, at 1:15, Holmes straightened. "Look." I pressed my face to the cold glass. The rain had lightened, and a gossamer mist had rolled in from the moor, clinging low to the hedges and trees. Through it, faint but unmistakable, was a figure. A tall man, cloaked and hat-brimmed, making his way toward the lake path. "He walks with a limp," Holmes murmured. "Richard Draycott?" Holmes did not answer. He was already reaching for his coat. We followed at a distance, careful not to let our lanterns betray us. The fog thickened as we reached the trees, swallowing sound and blurring the outlines of stone and branch. Ahead, the figure paused by the boathouse, looking about as if listening for something, or someone. Then, as if sensing pursuit, the man turned and bolted toward the woods. "Quickly!" Holmes hissed. We gave chase, ducking low branches and dodging roots slick with rain. The figure moved fast despite the limp, but Holmes was faster. Near the edge of the tree line, he lunged forward and tackled the man to the ground. "Stay down!" Holmes barked, producing a small pistol from within his coat. I caught up just as Holmes rolled the man over. It was indeed Richard Draycott. His face was gaunt, his beard unkempt, but his eyes burned with sharp intelligence and a spark of rage.
"I'm not the enemy," he spat. "You're making a mistake." Holmes remained composed. "That depends entirely on your definition of the word enemy. Perhaps you'd like to explain why you've been skulking around your brother's estate, leaving monogrammed cigars like a breadcrumb trail for suspicion." Richard glared at him. "I came to stop this madness. I've been watching for days trying to reach Cedric, but the house is a nest of secrets, and someone doesn't want me found." "Indeed," Holmes said. "Let's take this inside."
Back at the hall, in the dim glow of the study fire, Richard sat dripping in a high-backed chair, while Holmes dried his hands and addressed him evenly. "You received a telegram instructing you to return," Holmes said. "Signed R, but the contents suggest you didn't write it. Someone posed as you." Richard nodded. "That's correct. I have no idea who sent it. But the moment I arrived in Alnwick, I knew something was wrong. The locals were whispering about the curse. When I tried to visit Cedric, Pell turned me away. That night, someone fired a shot at me from the woods." "Which you didn't report?" "I couldn't. I have no legal standing here anymore. I left after our falling out. I thought it best not to stir waters already troubled." "And what do you know of Roderick's writings?" Richard looked away. "More than Cedric does. I studied them in Florence during my time abroad. They're disturbing but brilliant. He used certain plant extracts in his ink. Laurel, mandrake, belladonna. The Italian scholars thought he was mad, but I knew better. His work was alchemical." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you brought those insights back with you?" Richard hesitated. "Some, not all." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Tell me, Richard, who do you think killed Annabel and poisoned George?" At that, Richard's face changed. I believe it's someone in the house. Someone who wanted to scare Cedric, discredit me, and create a legend to hide behind. The poisonings aren't random, they're rehearsed, orchestrated. Holmes rose slowly. You're correct, but I do not believe you are the conductor. You were the red herring, the ghost in the fog. He turned to me. Watson, I believe the final act must now be staged. Noon tomorrow, library, everyone assembled. And then? I asked. Then, Holmes said with a quiet certainty, we shall pull the curtain. Chapter 6. The Ink That Kills. The following morning dawned crisp and pale, the storm spent, leaving behind a hush as though nature itself was holding its breath. At breakfast, the household sat in strained silence. Sir Cedric toyed with his spoon. Lady Draycott did not appear. Holmes said little, but his eyes moved constantly, watching, calculating. Are you certain the gathering is wise? I asked, as we stepped into the corridor. Holmes smiled faintly. The killer has laid out their tale like an author crafting a finale. I'm simply obliging them with an audience. At 10, Holmes requested the use of the study to prepare. By 11, he had locked the door and forbidden any interruptions. I found him standing at the desk, carefully mixing powders into a dish with the tip of a glass rod. Beside him sat the infamous Quill, the remaining forged parchment, and a row of litmus strips. This, he said without looking up, is the weapon. Elegant, subtle, and like all great lies wrapped in the suggestion of truth, he held up the quill and turned it toward the light. Last night, I confirmed it. The ink used on this parchment contains an extract of Aconitum ferox, Indian wolf's bane, potent, nearly undetectable. It causes cardiac arrest when absorbed through the skin in minute amounts. Applied how? By dampening the tip of the quill, then encouraging contact through page turning, touching the lips or pressing a finger to one's temple in concentration. Enough enters the bloodstream. The body fails. A curse is born. I nodded grimly. And the footman, George? He recovered slightly overnight, Holmes said. I spoke with him at dawn. He remembered touching his forehead while reading the letter aloud. His hands were damp. That was enough. And Annabelle? She dusted the library chair. The killer had smeared a residue of the same ink on the wood, where one's hand naturally rests. He wiped the rod clean and faced me. Today, we reveal the author of this theatrical farce, the poisoner, the playwright. At precisely noon, the household assembled in the library. Sir Cedric stood by the hearth, drawn and tense. Richard Draycott leaned against the windowsill, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. Lady Draycott entered last, dressed in dove grey, her gloved hands folded neatly. Holmes stood by the writing desk, the cursed quill placed reverently in a glass case before him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are gathered today not in fear, but to confront a fiction, a dangerous, clever fiction, one that has killed 2 people and nearly claimed more." He paused, letting his words settle. The legend of Roderick Draycott and his cursed quill has provided the perfect disguise for murder. But I assure you, it is no curse, it is chemistry, the work of a human hand. He gestured to the case. This quill was laced with aconite-based ink. Each victim was exposed to it through careful staging. George read a poisoned letter. Annabelle cleaned a surface daubed with residue. Both incidents were made to look like manifestations of a ghostly curse. Murmurs rippled through the room. Holmes's gaze swept the group. So, who had access to the cellar vaults? Who knew of Roderick's hidden writings, understood poison extraction, and had reason to sow chaos within these walls? His eyes rested on Lady Draycott. "You did?" She blinked once, then gave a soft laugh. "You're accusing me?" "I am." Sir Cedric turned to her in disbelief. "Margaret?" Holmes continued. "You studied in Italy, you read Latin, you understood the myth of the mad poet and how it might be weaponized. You forged the parchment in a blend of original and imitation verses. You retrieved the quill from the vault, using a copy of the old key your husband never knew you possessed. You poisoned the ink." Her eyes narrowed, but her composure held. "And the motive, Mr. Holmes?" "You were aware of Sir Cedric's failing finances. The estate, if entailed, would pass to Richard upon Sir Cedric's death, but should Sir Cedric be declared unstable, driven mad by curses, or die tragically, you would control the inheritance. The chaos you created would also discredit Richard and remove all obstacles." Richard stepped forward, face taut with anger. "You would have killed Cedric?" "I suspect," Holmes said, "the final act was meant for today. A dramatic, fatal reading, a poisoned finale, but I have replaced the parchment." He opened the glass case, revealing a blank sheet where once lay the verses. "The ink, too, has been neutralized." Lady Draycott's silence stretched long. Then she smiled. "A clever performance, Mr. Holmes?" Her hand went to her waist, and suddenly, from within her coat, she withdrew a small vial. "Don't move!" Holmes warned. But she moved, and Richard, quick as breath, crossed the room and seized her wrist. The vial dropped to the carpet, shattering. She did not resist. Instead, she slumped into the chair by the fire, her expression unreadable. "I should have left when the letters started working," she said softly. "But you meddled, Holmes. You always do." Sir Cedric stood frozen, as if some part of him refused to accept what he'd heard. Holmes stepped forward and gently took the gloves from Lady Draycott's hands. Beneath, her fingertips were stained, a faint purplish hue. "Your own ink," he said. "Absorbed over weeks, a trace on every letter, every parchment." She looked up at Sir Cedric, her expression cool and distant. "You never loved this house as I did. You let it rot. I wanted to preserve it, to become its future, not its fading past." Sir Cedric bowed his head. Holmes gave a signal. Pell, waiting outside, entered with 2 constables from Alnwick, previously summoned by Holmes. Lady Draycott rose and went with them without protest. That evening, as the sun bled into the hills, Holmes and I walked along the now still lake. "You knew it was her," I said, "even before the telegram." "Yes. The ash on the library chair, the cigarette brand, the linguistic errors in the forged Latin. Not enough to fool a scholar, but enough to reveal she hadn't read deeply. And of course, her gloves, always worn indoors, hiding contact stains. She planned it like a stage drama." Holmes nodded, as all great villains do. He stopped by the boathouse and gazed across the water. "There's a strange poetry to it, Watson. A cursed quill, a deadly ink. But in the end, it wasn't the legend that killed. It was ambition." Chapter 7. The Theatre of Deceit. The morning after Lady Draycott's arrest, Draycott Hall was unnaturally quiet. The household moved about as if in mourning, though for whom, the victims or their mistress, none could quite say. A fog lay over the grounds again, less heavy than before, but enough to blur the boundaries of reality, as if the estate itself were trying to forget what it had witnessed. Holmes, however, was as lucid as ever, moving through the house with that familiar intensity that suggested the case, though solved, had one final layer yet to be revealed. "We have a confession," I said, as I joined him in the library. "A clear motive, physical evidence, and 2 attempted murders foiled. Surely that's the end of it." Holmes was inspecting the bookshelf, not reading, but observing the dust, the placement of volumes, the minute details that escaped the average eye. "No, Watson," he replied, Not quite the end. Lady Draycott was the instrument, but not the composer. I stared at him. You mean someone else planned the scheme? She played her part well, but certain elements do not fit her profile. The telegram to Richard, for example. She had no access to the telegram office in Alnwick. The Latin phrasing in the first letter was beyond her fluency, and the ink formula, it required knowledge not merely of poisons, but of alchemical composition. That knowledge resides elsewhere. He turned to me sharply. Tell me, Watson, where was Sir Cedric the night Annabel died? I blinked. I believe he claimed to be asleep. Indeed. No one confirmed it. You suspect him? I suspect he played a larger role than we've been led to believe. Later that day, Holmes called a private meeting with Sir Cedric in the drawing room. The baronet, now visibly aged by the past week's revelations, received Holmes with a mixture of fatigue and guarded politeness. I presume you wish to discuss my wife, Sir Cedric said, pouring 2 glasses of port. In part, Holmes said. But more importantly, I wish to discuss you. Sir Cedric raised an eyebrow. Me? Holmes sipped, then set the glass down. I believe your wife acted under instruction, that she believed herself to be protecting your legacy, but the extent of her precision, her access, and her restraint all suggest that someone else dictated the terms. Sir Cedric's mouth thinned. I believe, Holmes continued, that you orchestrated the idea of the curse. You resurrected Roderick's myth, knowing the household would be susceptible. You created the fiction, she carried out the details. There was a long silence. Then Sir Cedric sighed. You're not wrong, he said. I straightened in my chair, stunned. You planned the murders? I asked. Not murder, Sir Cedric snapped. Correction. The estate was dying, Doctor. I was drowning in debt. The tenants were leaving. No heirs, no future. My brother, Richard, gone for years, returned with a solicitor in tow, threatening to stake a claim. Margaret, clever as she is, had no legal leverage, but fear. Fear could hold the estate together. I told her a story, that's all. Fed her just enough truth to make it real. Roderick's quill, the ink, the journals. She built the rest. Holmes's voice was cold. You watched her nearly kill 2 people. Sir Cedric downed his port. And you let it happen, Holmes added. You needed chaos. You wanted Richard out of the way. And if the legend consumed a few servants along the way, so be it. Margaret was never meant to go that far, Sir Cedric said, his voice tightening. She wanted permanence. I wanted survival. Holmes stood. You will give a statement, full, without reservation. Otherwise, when she stands trial, the whole story will be yours alone to tell, and no one will believe you were merely an architect. Sir Cedric slumped in his chair. She'll never forgive me. Holmes didn't reply. That evening, we stood in the great hall as Richard Draycott prepared to leave. His carriage waited by the gravel drive, the last of the fog lifting behind him. You've inherited the estate, Holmes said. It seems it's yours after all. I didn't want it this way, Richard replied. But I intend to restore it, properly. No ghosts, no poison pens. He extended a hand. Thank you, Holmes, for clearing my name. Holmes shook it. Be sure the name remains clear. As the carriage rolled away, Holmes turned to me. Now, Watson, there's still the matter of the manuscript. In the library, we retrieved the final volume of Roderick Draycott's journal from Holmes's valise. Holmes held it a moment before replacing it in the cabinet. It belongs here, he said, but I've removed the formula. That shall remain unpublished. I nodded. Strange, isn't it? The very thing Roderick created in his madness nearly brought about more death, long after his time. Holmes glanced at the fire. Madness rarely dies, Watson. It simply waits for someone to pick up the pen. Chapter 8. The Calm After the Quill. It was our final morning at Draycott Hall, and though the weather had cleared, the house still bore the weight of all it had witnessed. The servants moved with hushed purpose. The great clock in the hall ticked too loudly. Silence had returned, not as a comfort, but as an aftermath. Holmes and I took breakfast in the morning room. The meal was sparse: toast, eggs, and a single pot of black tea. But neither of us had much appetite. Holmes was unusually still, fingers steepled beneath his chin as he stared out at the mist lifting from the distant lake. "Odd, isn't it, Watson?" he said at last, "how the conclusion of a case often leaves one not with satisfaction, but with a peculiar melancholy." I looked up from the newspaper, which carried a discreet column on Lady Draycott's arrest and the coroner's findings in the deaths of George Lyle and Annabel. "You solved it, Holmes. You prevented further tragedy. That ought to bring some measure of satisfaction." Holmes shook his head slowly. "Oh, the logic was satisfying, yes, the pieces fit, but this—" he gestured broadly to the manor. "This place is a tomb dressed as a home. They tried to preserve it with deceit, and it crumbled beneath them." He rose and paced to the window. "The most dangerous lies, Watson, are the ones built on half-truths. Sir Cedric took fragments of Roderick's legacy, the alchemy, the verse, the family mythos, and wove them into a fiction he found useful. And Lady Draycott, well, she turned it into doctrine." "She believed it," I said. "To the very end. That's what made her so effective. A fanatic who thinks herself the hero of a story will cross any line." There was a knock at the door. Sir Cedric entered, looking 10 years older than he had when we'd first arrived. His coat hung loose from his shoulders, and his silver hair was untamed, as if sleep had become a stranger. "I wanted to thank you, Mr. Holmes," he said stiffly, "and to offer my apologies, Dr. Watson. I've treated truth like a chess piece." Holmes inclined his head, but said nothing. Sir Cedric cleared his throat. "I've signed the estate over to Richard. The papers will be filed today. I'll be leaving for the continent, somewhere quiet, where no one knows my name." He hesitated, then added softly, "Do you believe she'll recover in time?" Holmes's expression did not change. "Some wounds fester, others scar, but I believe she will live. As for forgiveness, that is a matter between her and herself." Sir Cedric nodded once, then turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like the final lines of a poem. Later that morning, Richard Draycott met us by the gates to see us off. He had taken quickly to his role, now dressed in a clean waistcoat and overcoat, with the quiet dignity of a man who had inherited not just property, but the burdens that came with it. "Will you stay in England now?" Holmes asked. "For a time," Richard said. "There's work to be done. I intend to sell some of the land, restore the village school, perhaps even open the manor for guests in summer. Let a bit of sunlight into this place." Holmes regarded him for a moment. "You understand now, I hope, why your brother feared your return." Richard gave a rueful smile. "I do, but I wish he had told me." "Secrets rarely survive the telling," Holmes said, "but sometimes they must be told anyway." He extended a hand, which Richard took firmly. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. I owe you more than I can say." We departed soon after, the carriage rocking gently as we left the estate behind. I watched the gates close through the rear window, ivy curling like fingers around the wrought iron bars. A chapter of the past, sealed once more. On the journey back to London, Holmes said little. He dozed briefly, then awoke and stared out the window, his brow furrowed in quiet reflection. "You know, Watson," he said at last, "the quill itself was never cursed, but but it inspired more destruction than any blade or bullet I've encountered. It's a testament to how dangerous symbols can be in the wrong hands." I nodded. "It wasn't the ink that killed. It was the story built around it." "Precisely. And we live in a world hungry for stories, curses, miracles, conspiracies. They offer simple explanations for complex truths." "Do you believe we'll see more cases like this?" I asked. Holmes gave a thin smile. "As long as men fear shadows and seek shortcuts to power, yes. The methods may evolve, but the motives remain constant." We arrived in Baker Street just as dusk settled over the rooftops. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with a look of immense relief, though she wisely said nothing beyond, "Tea's already brewed, Mr. Holmes." In our familiar sitting room, with the fire crackling and London's steady hum returning to our ears, I finally felt the oppressive atmosphere of Draycott Hall lift from my shoulders. Holmes unpacked the remnants of the case. He placed the blank manuscript paper in his file drawer, locked the quill inside a lead-lined case, and removed a small, folded note from his breast pocket. "What's that?" I asked. He handed it to me. It was written in Lady Draycott's elegant hand. Just 3 lines. "To preserve a house, I became its ghost. To save a name, I wore a mask. But no ink can change the truth." I set it down, unsure how to feel. "She was wrong, of course," Holmes said, watching the flames. "Ink doesn't change the truth, but it can bury it." Then he reached for his violin and without a word more began to play.